Today we're going to delve into the case of a girl who went missing from her bedroom in the middle of the night. Her sister, who shared the bed with her, witnessed something strange. She said that a man wearing a wizard hat had taken her. This case remained unsolved for 35 years, but in 2024, the truth finally came to light. It was a case that haunted South Carolina for more than 3 decades. A 4-year-old girl vanished from her bedroom in the middle of the night, leaving behind a mystery that remained unsolved for 35 years. But in 2024, the truth behind Jessica Gutierrez's disappearance finally came to light. Jessica Gutierrez was born on December 3, 1981, in the small town of Edmond, just outside the state capital. The youngest of 4 children, she grew up in a modest household with 2 older sisters and a brother. After Jessica's parents divorced, her mother Debbie raised the children on her own, juggling work and parenting without much support. Despite the challenges, the family remained close-knit. When Debbie worked, the older kids cared for Jessica. When she had time off, she tried to make life fun for all of them. June 5, 1986 began like any other summer day. Jessica, then 4, spent the day playing in the yard with her siblings while Debbie tended to chores around the house. That evening, the family had dinner together, and Debbie tucked the children into bed. Normally, Jessica slept with her mother, but that night was different. Jessica's brother had an earache, so he took her usual spot. Jessica ended up sleeping in a bed with her 6-year-old sister Rebecca, while their eldest sister slept nearby. The next morning, around 9 a.m., Debbie was awakened by Rebecca asking for cereal. As she got up to start the day, Debbie noticed something odd. The front door, which she always locked at night, was wide open. Their dog, typically kept outside, was running through the house. A curtain rod lay on the floor beneath a back window, and the window screen had been removed. When Debbie entered the girl's bedroom, Jessica was gone. Papers were scattered on the floor, but there was no sign of her daughter. Panicked, she asked the older girls where Jessica was. Rebecca's response sent chills down her spine. "She's gone. A man with a beard and a magic hat took her." At first, Debbie thought her daughter was just making up a story. She searched the house and the yard, hoping Jessica had simply wandered off. But when her efforts turned up nothing, panic set in. Returning to the bedroom, she pressed Rebecca for answers. Why hadn't she screamed? Why didn't she tell anyone sooner? That's when Rebecca shared more details. She said she had woken up in the middle of the night to see a man with a beard wearing what looked like a magic hat, a wizard's hat, standing by their bed. The man gently picked up Jessica, who was still asleep, and quietly walked out with her. Rebecca, just 6 years old, didn't understand what was happening. Terrified, she pulled the blanket over her head and convinced herself it had been a dream. She fell back asleep and didn't mention it until the morning. Realizing her daughter might be telling the truth, Debbie immediately called the police. When officers arrived at the Gutierrez home, they immediately launched a thorough search. It didn't take long for them to conclude what Debbie Gutierrez feared most. 4-year-old Jessica had likely been abducted. Evidence pointed to a break-in through the living room window, where the protective screen had been removed. Closer examination of the window yielded a critical clue: a fingerprint on the outside of the glass. Investigators photographed the print and sent it for expert analysis. Near the window, they also found a pack of cigarettes and several cigarette butts, suggesting the abductor may have lingered before entering the house. Realizing they were dealing with a possible kidnapping, authorities took quick action. They installed a recording device on Debbie's home phone in case the kidnapper reached out with a ransom demand. 6-year-old Rebecca once again recounted what she had seen that night. Her story remained consistent. A bearded man in a wizard hat had taken Jessica. This time she added new details. The intruder had unplugged the fan and nightlight in the room before approaching the bed. However, she had not seen his face clearly, leaving investigators without a usable suspect description. Detectives began to zero in on those closest to the family. Debbie was brought in for questioning and asked to walk them through every detail of the previous day. During the interview, she revealed a troubling lead. Just days earlier, she had ended a relationship with a man she had been dating for several months. According to Debbie, he had a temper, drank frequently, and had become increasingly controlling. She believed he might have taken Jessica as a form of revenge. Debbie called the man from the police station, but he denied any involvement. Investigators followed up, probing his background and checking his alibi, but ultimately found no evidence linking him to the crime. They also ruled out Jessica's biological father as a suspect. He had been living out of state at the time and had no possible way of abducting her. As the investigation continued, forensic experts ran the fingerprint found on the window through the FBI's database, but came up empty. With no solid leads, police shifted their focus to an intensive search of the surrounding area. The Gutierrez home sat on the outskirts of Edmond, surrounded by miles of open fields and scattered woodlands. Search teams scoured abandoned buildings, wooded areas, nearby creeks, and rivers. The following day, the FBI officially joined the investigation, but still, no trace of Jessica was found. Law enforcement ramped up public outreach. Flyers bearing Jessica's photo were distributed not only throughout the town, but across the entire state. The sheriff's office even dispatched a small plane to conduct aerial searches of the region. Despite the massive search operation, Debbie found herself largely sidelined. With 3 other children to care for, she couldn't join the search herself. To make matters worse, communication with law enforcement was sporadic. The police rarely updated her unless she initiated contact. 2 days after Jessica's disappearance on a Saturday, Debbie called the sheriff directly. Desperate for answers, she asked whether the search would continue through the weekend. The conversation quickly became heated. Overwhelmed with grief and frustration, Debbie accused the sheriff of negligence and failing to take her daughter's case seriously. The sheriff fired back, claiming he had been out searching all night. He warned Debbie that if she continued making accusations, he would pull his team off the case entirely and forget about it. What he didn't know was that Debbie's phone was still wired for recording. She saved the conversation, a potentially damning record of how authorities handled the case in its earliest and most critical hours. In the months following Jessica Gutierrez's disappearance, her mother Debbie grew increasingly disillusioned with law enforcement. She believed authorities weren't doing enough to find her daughter, and with each passing day, her hope of seeing Jessica alive again began to fade. Then, nearly 10 weeks after Jessica vanished, an unexpected development breathed new life into the investigation. Local police had been dealing with a string of unrelated crimes. A man had attempted to break into a home, but was scared off by the armed resident. Not long after, the same man stole a van and drove to North Carolina, where he broke into a woman's home and assaulted her while she slept. He was arrested shortly after that incident, and during the booking process, his fingerprints were entered into the national database. That's when the system flagged a match. His prints were identical to those found on the window of the Gutierrez home the morning Jessica disappeared. The man was identified as 27-year-old Thomas McDowell. When Debbie Gutierrez heard the name, she immediately recognized it. She told police that she had met McDowell through family members. Just a few months before Jessica's disappearance, she had hired him to do some work around the house. Over the course of 2 days, McDowell built a shed in the backyard and repaired the awning above the porch. Debbie recalled that McDowell had a full beard and wore a tall cowboy hat, a detail that suddenly seemed significant. Investigators considered the possibility that Rebecca, only 6 years old at the time and seeing the intruder in the dark, might have confused the cowboy hat for a magic or wizard's hat, like those in children's cartoons. Still, despite the fingerprint match and McDowell's connection to the family, investigators hit a roadblock. They ultimately determined that there was not enough evidence to press charges. Jessica's body had never been found, and without it, they couldn't confirm whether she was dead or alive. The presence of McDowell's fingerprints on the window, while highly suspicious, wasn't, in their eyes, conclusive proof of a crime. Investigators theorized that McDowell's prints could have been left there during the time he worked on Debbie's property. However, this explanation seemed unlikely. Forensic experts who examined the print noted that it appeared fresh and hadn't been exposed to weather conditions that would typically degrade such evidence over time. Debbie also emphasized that she cleaned that particular window frequently. Her children often ran up to it from the yard to call inside, leaving dirty handprints on the glass, a regular occurrence that prompted her to wipe it down often. Additionally, McDowell had worked on the property about 6 months before Jessica's disappearance, and no other prints were found on the window during the investigation. If his fingerprint had been there from earlier work, experts argued, it almost certainly would have been wiped away long ago. Debbie also recalled a key moment from McDowell's time at her home. One day, she had accidentally locked herself out of the house and had to climb in through that very window. McDowell had witnessed her do it, a detail that raised further concerns. Had he seen an opportunity and taken mental note of an easy entry point? Despite these compelling facts, authorities stood firm. Without a body or eyewitness identification, they still believed the case lacked the hard evidence needed to move forward against McDowell. And so, the lead that had seemed so promising was left to cool, and Jessica's case once again went cold. In 1987, 1 year after Jessica Gutierrez disappeared from her South Carolina home, a new development once again pointed to Thomas McDowell, the man whose fingerprint had been found on the window the night she vanished. That year, McDowell was convicted in an unrelated case, the assault of a woman whose home he had broken into in North Carolina. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. For Debbie Gutierrez, it was devastating to see him punished for another crime, while the authorities still refused to charge him in connection with her daughter's abduction. But then came a shocking revelation. Later that same year, one of McDowell's cellmates came forward to police with a disturbing story. He claimed that McDowell had confessed to abducting a young girl from her bedroom in South Carolina with the intent to assault her. According to the cellmate, McDowell said the girl bit him during the attack, and in a fit of rage, he killed her. He allegedly told the cellmate he had dismembered the child's remains and left them in a remote field. Investigators working Jessica's case traveled to the prison to interview McDowell. Surprisingly, he didn't deny the allegations. Instead, he offered to confess, but only if he was granted full immunity from prosecution. Authorities refused, unwilling to give legal protection to someone admitting to such a horrific crime. Once again, the case stalled. McDowell's cellmate, frustrated that justice wasn't being served, wrote directly to Debbie. In his letter, he recounted what McDowell had told him. For Debbie, it was yet another heartbreaking confirmation of what she had long suspected, and another reminder that the system had failed her daughter. Tired of waiting on authorities, Debbie took matters into her own hands. She began investigating on her own. During one of her efforts, she managed to locate an abandoned car that had previously belonged to McDowell. Inside, on one of the seats, she found threads and fibers that closely resembled the fabric of the pajamas Jessica had been wearing the night she disappeared. But police dismissed the discovery. To them, the idea that a grieving mother, without forensic training or specialized equipment, had uncovered key evidence seemed implausible. They chose not to follow up on the lead. That same year, 1987, another emotional setback unfolded. Police in Kansas contacted South Carolina authorities, reporting that they had found a young girl who matched Jessica's description. Debbie immediately flew there, clinging to a fragile hope. But it was crushed the moment she heard the girl's voice from down the hall. She knew instantly it wasn't her daughter. Over the years, Debbie continued speaking out publicly. She gave multiple interviews, calling out the authorities for what she saw as their repeated failure to act on clear evidence and their unwillingness to pursue McDowell more aggressively. Despite her efforts, no real progress was made. In 1990, Jessica's case was featured on a nationally televised program about unsolved crimes. The exposure led to a surge of new tips, but none of them brought investigators any closer to the truth. The following year, Jessica became the first missing child in South Carolina to be featured in an age-progressed portrait, a technology still in its infancy in the early 1990s. Detectives hoped the image might spark recognition and finally lead to answers. But despite this new tool, the trail remained cold. For years, the case languished in silence. Leads dried up, and Jessica's disappearance remained one of South Carolina's most haunting unsolved mysteries, with a grieving mother still fighting for justice. In 2007, 21 years after her daughter Jessica's disappearance, Debbie Gutierrez once again took her fight for justice public. This time, she shared a damning piece of evidence with reporters, a recorded conversation with the local sheriff in which he warned that he could pull his officers off the case and forget about it altogether. When questioned, the sheriff defended his actions. He insisted that he had never stopped investigating Jessica's case over the years. In fact, he claimed that following his heated conversation with Debbie, he assigned more officers to the investigation, not fewer. Debbie, however, expressed deep frustration. She said that for years, she had attempted to involve outside agencies in the case, only to be blocked repeatedly by the local prosecutor's office. That same year, the case was reviewed again. Authorities concluded that, despite lingering suspicion, there was still insufficient evidence to formally charge anyone with Jessica's abduction or presumed murder. In the years that followed, two key figures in the case came under legal fire. In 2014, the same sheriff who had overseen the investigation for decades was convicted on charges of fraud and bribery. He was dismissed from office and sentenced to 12 months in jail. Then, in 2016, the local prosecutor, who had allegedly blocked external involvement in the case, was arrested for a hit-and-run while under the influence. He was fined $11,000 and subsequently resigned. It wasn't until 2021, 35 years after Jessica vanished, that a significant breakthrough finally came. With new leadership in place, the case was reopened by Lexington County's new sheriff, Jay, who partnered with the FBI. A task force of 50 agents was assigned to re-examine every piece of available evidence and explore new leads. The investigation soon gained momentum. Not only did agents reaffirm that there was now sufficient evidence to implicate Thomas McDowell, but they also uncovered new circumstantial links tying him to the crime. According to friends and family members, McDowell dramatically altered his appearance in the days following Jessica's disappearance, shaving off his signature beard and long hair, and abandoning the tall cowboy hat he was known for. Witnesses also noted that McDowell smoked the same brand of cigarettes that had been found discarded near the Gutierrez home the morning Jessica went missing. Unfortunately, due to prior rounds of forensic testing, no usable DNA could be recovered from the old physical evidence. Any biological traces that may once have existed were likely destroyed during early investigative handling. Despite the absence of DNA, investigators believed they now had enough. The fingerprint on the window, the witness accounts, the behavioral changes, and the jailhouse confession given years earlier by McDowell's former cellmate. In January 2022, Thomas McDowell, by then 62 years old, was finally arrested in connection with Jessica Gutierrez's abduction and presumed murder. He maintained his innocence, refusing to confess. Preparations for the trial stretched on for years, as prosecutors meticulously assembled the case they hoped would finally deliver long overdue justice for Jessica and closure for a mother who never stopped fighting. The long-awaited trial of Thomas McDowell began in January 2024, marking the first time he faced a courtroom in connection with the disappearance of 4-year-old Jessica Gutierrez, nearly 38 years after the crime. McDowell's defense team attempted to cast doubt on the evidence, arguing that the fingerprint found on the window of the Gutierrez home had been left during the time he worked on the property months before the abduction. They also questioned the reliability of the eyewitness account from Jessica's sister, Rebecca, who was just 6 years old at the time. The defense argued it was implausible for a child to mistake a cowboy hat for a wizard hat, as she had described. But forensic experts brought in by the prosecution disputed those claims. They testified that the fingerprint appeared fresh and showed no signs of weather exposure, something that would have inevitably occurred if the print had been left months earlier. Given that the window had been regularly cleaned, they maintained it was highly unlikely the print had remained intact since McDowell's brief stint on the property. The most damning piece of testimony came from a former inmate, who reiterated what McDowell had told him while they were cellmates in 1987. The man described in detail how McDowell had admitted to abducting and killing a young girl in South Carolina. Prosecutors emphasized that the witness was from out of state and had no prior knowledge of the case, making it unlikely he could have fabricated the account. They also reminded the jury that back in 1987, McDowell had told investigators he was willing to confess, but only if granted full immunity, a request the authorities had refused. On February 8, 2024, the jury delivered its verdict, guilty on all counts. McDowell, now 63 years old, was sentenced to life in prison. For Jessica's mother, Debbie Gutierrez, the verdict was a bittersweet victory. She had long believed McDowell was responsible and spent nearly 4 decades fighting for justice. While she expressed relief that he had finally been held accountable, she couldn't help but reflect on the years lost. He could have been arrested 36 years ago, she said, but instead, they let him live a long life before facing justice. Despite the conviction, one heartbreaking truth remains. Jessica's body has never been found. Debbie, now in her 60s, continues to work with law enforcement, particularly the new sheriff, in the ongoing search for her daughter's remains. But with nearly 4 decades having passed, the chances of finding them grow slimmer with each year. Still, for Debbie, the fight is far from over. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means a lot to us and helps us grow. A huge thank you to everyone who's been watching. In 1972, 9-year-old Debbie Lynn Randall vanished while walking home from a neighborhood laundromat in Marietta, Georgia. What followed was one of the most heartbreaking and enduring unsolved child murder cases in the state's history. Debbie Lynn Randall was born on August 21, 1962, in the suburban heart of Marietta, Georgia. The youngest of 3 siblings, she was raised in a warm, tight-knit household with her 2 older brothers. Life changed early on when her parents divorced, but her father stayed active in their lives. Not long after, Debbie's mother remarried a man named Roy, who stepped into the role of a stepfather. Together, the blended family settled into a modest apartment complex, nestled in a quiet neighborhood near a military base. Debbie was the picture of childhood joy, lively, sweet-natured, and full of laughter. She loved playing basketball with friends and was especially fond of her growing doll collection, which she spent countless hours arranging and imagining stories for. By all accounts, she was a happy child in a loving, if modest, home. On the evening of January 13, 1972, 9-year-old Debbie had dinner with her family, just like any other day. After the meal, her mother decided it was time to tackle the laundry, a chore Debbie was familiar with. It wasn't unusual for her to help with the task. The laundromat was conveniently located just across the street, only a few hundred yards away. Debbie often passed the time chatting with other girls while the clothes cycled through the wash. That night, her mother initially asked one of Debbie's older brothers to go with her. He wasn't feeling well and had his heart set on watching his favorite television show, so the job instead fell to her stepfather. Debbie, carrying a box of detergent, accompanied him to the laundromat. Once the clothes were loaded into 2 machines, Roy left, and Debbie remained behind to wait. When the wash was done, she was supposed to return home and get help retrieving the laundry, since it was too heavy for her to carry alone. It was a routine errand, familiar, safe, and seemingly uneventful. But that night, everything changed. As the evening wore on and the sky began to dim, Debbie Lynn Randall's mother grew uneasy. Her daughter should have been home by now. The laundry cycle would have long finished. Sensing something was wrong, she and her husband Roy decided to walk over to the laundromat. But when they arrived, there was no sign of Debbie. The laundromat employee gave them unsettling news. Debbie had already left some time ago and hadn't returned. Panic began to creep in. Her mother and Roy fanned out into the nearby streets, scanning the sidewalks and calling her name. A short distance from the laundromat, just a few dozen yards away, something caught their eye. In a parking lot beside a car, there was a spill of white powder. Detergent. Debbie had been carrying a box of it, and her mother's heart sank. It could only mean one thing. They searched the area frantically, circling the parking lot and peering into corners and alleyways, but there was no other trace of the little girl. Neighbors, recognizing the urgency and distress, came out to join the search. Despite their efforts, the night yielded no answers. Desperation setting in, Debbie's mother called the police. Officers arrived quickly and turned their attention to the detergent spill. It lay just inches from a parked car. On the vehicle's door, they discovered what looked like fresh fingerprints, several of them noticeably lower than the door handle. It was a strange detail and a chilling one. Investigators theorized that someone might have grabbed Debbie at that very spot, possibly touching the car in the process. They carefully collected the prints and sent them to forensic specialists, while also beginning the process of locating the car's owner to rule them out. With no other leads immediately available, the search widened. Officers went door to door, questioned passers-by, and canvassed nearby streets, hoping to unearth any clue, any witness. Back at the laundromat, the employee could only recall the ordinary. Debbie had been waiting quietly, then picked up her detergent and left, likely on her way home to get help retrieving the rest of the laundry. But from that moment on, Debbie Lynn Randall had vanished without a trace. Just as the investigation into Debbie Lynn Randall's disappearance began to stall, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source: a 12-year-old girl named Sandra. What she remembered would quickly shift the course of the case. That evening, Sandra had been walking toward the laundromat with a friend, both carrying loads of dirty laundry. As they approached, something startling unfolded right in front of them. A man suddenly grabbed a young girl in the middle of the street and forced her into a nearby car. A dark-colored pickup truck parked near the laundromat. The girl screamed and struggled to escape, but the man shoved her inside, slammed the door shut, and jumped behind the wheel. Without hesitation, he sped away. So fast, he nearly hit Sandra and her friend. One of the girls shouted after the vehicle, but it vanished down the road. At the time, Sandra didn't fully grasp what she had witnessed. She assumed the man was a parent or relative, perhaps dragging the girl home against her will after an argument. It wasn't until she heard about Debbie's abduction that the memory clicked. Realizing the gravity of what she had seen, Sandra came forward to tell investigators everything. Her testimony was critical. According to Sandra, the suspect was a young white man with thick, dark hair, dressed in a white t-shirt, jeans, and black work boots. He had been driving a dark pickup truck, possibly a 1957 model. Her story was soon corroborated by another girl, a neighbor who lived in the same apartment building as Debbie. That evening, she had been standing outside when a dark pickup truck slowly drove past. At first, she thought the man behind the wheel was her uncle, but when the truck came to a stop and the driver looked directly at her, she realized it wasn't him. She described the man as white with medium-length dark hair, and noted other subtle features that helped flesh out the composite sketch. She also recalled that the truck had parked just outside their building, right next to the car where the box of spilled detergent would later be found. With these new witness accounts, the investigation took on renewed urgency. For the first time, authorities had a potential description of the suspect and the vehicle in which Debbie may have been taken. Not long after the first eyewitness account surfaced, police found another lead, one that further cemented their worst fears. A man who lived near Debbie Randall's apartment was driving to the hospital to visit his wife when a dark pickup truck, believed to be a Dodge, came barreling toward him, nearly colliding with his car before speeding off erratically. He recalled the driver as a white man in his early 30s, with dark hair. But what he saw inside the vehicle was far more alarming. A young girl, visibly distressed, appeared to be struggling to get out as the driver restrained her with one hand. That was the confirmation detectives had been dreading. Debbie Lynn Randall hadn't simply wandered off. She had been abducted. With this grim certainty, authorities launched a full-scale operation. Descriptions of the suspect's vehicle were quickly circulated to patrol units across the state. Police sketch artists got to work, using the testimonies of 3 witnesses to create a composite image of the abductor. Officers began pulling over vehicles matching the description and tracking down their owners. Meanwhile, others organized systematic ground searches for the missing girl. What began as a local effort quickly grew into something unprecedented. Volunteers poured in from neighboring towns, joining officers in combing through neighborhoods, wooded areas, and abandoned buildings. At its peak, the search force swelled to nearly 4,000 people, the largest search effort in state history at the time. Investigators left no stone unturned. Every man who knew Debbie came under scrutiny. neighbors, her biological father, and her stepfather. All were questioned and ultimately ruled out. Debbie's father, who lived nearby, rushed from work the moment he learned of her disappearance and devoted himself to the search. Detectives also reviewed the backgrounds of previously convicted criminals living within a several-mile radius of the Randall home. Still, no viable suspects emerged. For over 2 agonizing weeks, the search dragged on with no sign of Debbie. Hope began to waver until the morning of January 29th. That day, a group of local students joined the search teams and were assigned to sweep a wooded area several miles from the Randall residence. After nearly 5 hours of trekking through the forest, one student spotted something unusual: faint drag marks cutting away from the main trail, disappearing into the dense underbrush. Following the trail for about 150 feet, the group stumbled upon a horrific discovery: a human body. They immediately alerted authorities. The mystery of Debbie Lynn Randall's disappearance had come to a heartbreaking end. The moment investigators arrived at the scene deep in the woods, their fears were confirmed. They had found Debbie Lynn Randall. She was still wearing the clothes her mother had described on the night she vanished: a lavender dress and a dark blue zip-up jacket with a hood. But something was missing. Her lavender shoes, a cherished Christmas gift she had received just weeks earlier, were nowhere to be found. She wore only socks on her feet. Debbie's body was carefully recovered and turned over to forensic pathologists. The medical examination revealed the devastating truth: she had died by strangulation. Signs of sexual assault were also present. The only physical clue left by the killer was a single dark hair found on her body. At the time, DNA technology was still years away from practical use. Under a microscope, experts concluded that the hair likely came from a male suspect between 18 and 30 years old. Despite limited forensic tools, investigators refused to give up. Debbie's clothing, caked in dirt and grime, became the next focal point. Desperate for answers, detectives enlisted the help of a geologist to work alongside the forensic team. Their collaboration would uncover something unexpected and significant. Analysis revealed that the dirt embedded in her clothing contained a specific type of clay, known to be mined only in one location less than 10 miles from Marietta. This distinct northern Georgia clay was unique to the region. But there was more. A second kind of dirt was found as well, pointing to another type of clay. This one extracted by a local company operating just 2 miles from the wooded site where her body had been discovered. These findings led detectives to a chilling theory. The killer had not murdered Debbie immediately. Instead, he likely drove her to at least 2 separate locations. The first, a remote area outside the city, was likely the site of the assault. From there, he took her to the second location, possibly near the clay mine, where he ended her life. Finally, he transported her body into the forest, dragging her from the road and leaving her deep among the trees. Even in death, Debbie Randall's small frame carried traces of the journey her killer had forced upon her. A journey investigators were now retracing, one layer of dirt at a time. Forensic evidence soon reinforced what detectives had begun to suspect. Debbie Lynn Randall had already been killed before her body was brought into the forest. There were no signs of a struggle at the discovery site, and the drag marks leading from the trail into the trees suggested she had been lifeless when moved. If the murder had taken place in that spot, investigators believed the ground would have told a very different story. Adding weight to this theory were the distinctive traces of clay found on Debbie's clothing. The 2 types of clay, one from a location nearly 10 miles outside Marietta, the other just 2 miles from the body, pointed to remote mining areas not easily accessible to outsiders. This raised an unsettling possibility. The killer may have had intimate knowledge of these sites. Detectives contacted the companies that operated those mines, and a supervisor confirmed their suspicions. Even seasoned workers sometimes found it difficult to navigate the terrain. It would have been nearly impossible for a stranger to find and move through those areas unnoticed. Investigators began combing through employment records, checking workers from both mining operations for any match to the suspect's description or a vehicle resembling the dark pickup truck. Yet again, they came up empty-handed. Back in the city, detectives also held on to another crucial piece of evidence: the fingerprints left on a car just inches from where Debbie was abducted. Every possible suspect's prints were compared, but none matched. As the grim details of Debbie's murder emerged, the entire community was shaken. The brutality of the crime stunned Marietta, and thousands turned out to say their goodbyes at her funeral. The local police, undeterred by the lack of progress, kept working tirelessly, following every lead, rechecking every angle. But over time, the trail grew colder, the clues faded, and the investigation hit wall after wall. Despite the passing years, the case never left the minds of those closest to it. Detectives continued to pursue it quietly in the background, examining dozens of suspects, but no arrests were ever made. For Morris Nix, the lead detective, the case became a defining part of his life. He was just 19 years old when Debbie disappeared, and from day one, he had been involved in the search and investigation. Through the decades, Nix chased leads, revisited witnesses, and gradually narrowed his focus to 4 individuals he believed were the most likely suspects. But hard evidence remained elusive. The mystery of who took Debbie Lynn Randall lingered, a haunting question that refused to be answered. Years after the case had gone cold, a glimmer of hope emerged through the advancement of forensic science. When the FBI established a national DNA database, investigators were finally able to extract a genetic profile from the hair found on Debbie Lynn Randall's body. The profile was entered into the system, but no matches were found. It suggested the killer had either never been convicted of a serious crime or committed the murder before DNA collection became standard practice for such offenses. In 2015, 43 years after Debbie's murder, the case was reopened. Detectives decided to re-examine her clothing using modern forensic techniques. Remarkably, the garments had been preserved in an evidence warehouse all those years. Scientists discovered traces of biological material belonging to an unknown man. Unfortunately, the DNA had degraded over time, and they were only able to develop a partial profile, not enough to identify a suspect. 3 years later, in 2018, Debbie's mother gave a rare and emotional interview. For decades, she had held on to hope that her daughter's killer would be brought to justice. After Debbie's death, she found it impossible to continue living in the apartment, where every detail reminded her of the tragedy. She relocated to another city, but the pain never left her. The slow progress in the investigation took its toll year after year. In the interview, she said her final wish was to see the case solved before her time came, but that wish would go unfulfilled. Just weeks after sharing her story, she passed away from cancer at the age of 78. She was buried beside her daughter. Sandra, the girl who had witnessed Debbie's abduction at age 12, also came forward around that time. In her interview, she admitted she had carried the weight of guilt for over 4 decades. Sandra said she often believed she could have done something to stop it, even if it meant sacrificing herself in Debbie's place. "I still think about it all the time," she said. "I would have taken her place if I could, In 2019, the local police department received new funding, a turning point in the decades-old investigation into the murder of Debbie Lynn Randall. With the additional resources, detectives authorized a more advanced forensic analysis of Debbie's preserved clothing. This time, scientists were able to extract a full DNA profile, but once again, it hit a wall. The perpetrator's DNA still wasn't in the FBI database. That same year, Debbie's father gave an emotional interview. He shared that not a single day had passed without thinking about his daughter. He still kept a box filled with her old photographs and held on to one simple hope: to be reunited with her in heaven. Just a few years later, in 2022, he passed away. But that year would also bring renewed determination to finally solve the case. Investigators decided to pursue the only promising lead left: the killer's DNA. They partnered with a Florida-based company that specialized in a cutting-edge technique called genetic genealogy. Police handed over the biological material they had collected over the years and waited. Using modern tools, experts built a profile of the unknown suspect and began combing public genetic databases in search of relatives. The process relies on the fact that family members, even distant ones, share identifiable genetic markers, and that some individuals voluntarily upload their DNA for ancestry research. After reviewing thousands of possible matches, the investigators narrowed it down to a family living in Marietta. In 2023, they asked several family members to voluntarily submit DNA samples, and they agreed. Lab results confirmed that the killer was a close relative. From there, detectives zeroed in on one individual, William Rose. But there was a catch. Rose had died by suicide in 1974, just 2 years after Debbie's murder. Despite this, police were determined to bring closure to the case. They obtained a court order to exhume his remains and took a direct DNA sample. More than half a century after Debbie Lynn Randall was abducted and killed, the case finally had an answer. The DNA was a perfect match. William Rose was confirmed to be her killer. At the time of Debbie Lynn Randall's murder, William Rose was just 24 years old and had never been on the radar of investigators. He had no criminal record, no known history of violence. In fact, there was nothing in his past to suggest he was capable of such a horrific crime. It was only after DNA identified him as the killer that detectives learned Rose had a connection to Debbie's neighborhood. Some of his relatives lived in the same apartment building as the Randall family, and he was known to visit them regularly. Investigators now believe that he likely saw Debbie on more than one occasion, possibly even growing familiar with her routine. On the night of the abduction, they suspect Rose may have been on his way to see his relatives when he spotted Debbie leaving the laundromat and walking home alone. According to witness statements from neighbors, Rose pulled his pickup truck into the parking lot between the laundromat and Debbie's home. He left the engine running, got out, and grabbed her. Then he drove off, heading north. Detectives believe he may have driven directly to the clay quarry in that direction, the same location where forensic evidence later traced some of the dirt found on Debbie's clothing. What makes the case even more chilling is that Rose never committed another known violent crime. Whether Debbie's murder was a one-time act, or whether he simply was never caught again, remains a mystery. By the time the case was officially closed, the only surviving close family member was Debbie's older brother, Melvin. He stood at the podium during the press conference announcing the identification of the killer, offering heartfelt thanks to everyone who had worked on the case over the past 51 years. "I just wish my mother had lived to see this day," he said, "but I know she's in heaven now." With Debbie, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means a lot to us and helps us grow. A huge thank you to everyone who's been watching. In 1966, 18-year-old Karen Snyder was found brutally stabbed to death in her home in Calumet, Illinois, just steps away from her sleeping infant daughter. A horrifying crime that shocked the quiet suburban town and remained unsolved for over half a century. Karen Snyder was born on July 29, 1948, in the small town of Cedar Lake, Indiana. She grew up in a large, close-knit family with 2 brothers and 3 sisters. In high school, she met a boy named Paul, and the two quickly fell in love. At just 17 years old, Karen decided to marry him. Not long after, the couple learned they were expecting their first child. In 1966, Karen gave birth to their daughter, Paula. Though only 18 at the time, Karen and Paul were excited to begin building a life together. They moved to Calumet, Illinois, a quiet town of about 25,000 people just outside Chicago, where Paul's parents lived. The couple settled on the same street, just a few houses away, making it easy for Paul's parents to visit often and spend time with their granddaughter. While Paul worked for the local railroad, Karen stayed home to care for their baby. Life in Calumet felt safe and simple, the kind of place where everyone knew their neighbors and trouble felt far away. But on November 12, 1966, something unexpected happened. Paul left for his night shift at around 2 p.m. as usual. A few hours into his shift, he tried to call Karen at home. She didn't answer, which immediately struck him as odd. Karen wasn't the type to leave the house, especially not with a 2-month-old baby who couldn't be left alone. Worried, Paul called his parents just a few doors down and asked them to check in on her. Paul's parents walked down the street to their son's house and knocked on the door, but there was no answer. Without a spare key, they continued knocking for several minutes before giving up and returning home to call Paul back with the unsettling news. Growing more anxious, Paul left work early to check on his wife and baby himself. As he neared the house, his concern deepened. The porch light, which Karen always left on during his night shifts, was off, and the blinds were tightly drawn. Something didn't feel right. He unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The living room light was on, and the television was playing. In a playpen nearby, his 2-month-old daughter lay peacefully asleep. But Karen was nowhere in sight. Calling her name, Paul moved through the house, checking each room. Still no sign of her. When he headed for the stairs, he flipped the light switch, but nothing happened. In the dim hallway, he climbed the stairs and entered the bedroom. There, under the faint glow of a bedside lamp, he found a nightmare. The room was in chaos. Blood stained the floor and walls, and Karen lay motionless in the middle of it. Paul immediately understood that she was gone. Shaken and overwhelmed, he rushed downstairs, called the police, and brought his baby outside to wait for help. Minutes later, his parents came out and saw their son crying in the street, desperate for someone to help. Paul's mother grabbed a flashlight and ran into the house, clinging to hope. But once she entered the bedroom and saw Karen's lifeless body, it was clear. There was nothing anyone could do. Not long after Paul's frantic call, medics and police arrived at the house. The paramedics could only confirm what was already feared. Karen Snyder was dead. With the home secured, investigators began processing the scene for evidence. One of the first things they noticed was a series of shallow scratches on the back door lock, clear signs of an attempted break-in. But the door was still locked from the inside, leading detectives to believe the intruder may have tried that route and failed. Their attention then turned to the basement. A window had been shattered, and a trail of blood led from the broken glass to the front door. Investigators theorized that the intruder cut themselves while trying to get through the window, but ultimately decided not to enter that way. Instead, the person may have found the front door unlocked, or perhaps Karen had unknowingly opened it for them. Inside the house, more evidence pointed to how the attack unfolded. Blood was found in the living room, just steps from where Karen's baby had been sleeping in her crib. Police believe that's where the assault began. From there, a trail of blood led up the staircase, down the hallway, and into the couple's bedroom, the site of the final, violent struggle. The bedroom was in complete disarray. Blood covered the room, and furniture and personal items had been knocked over or smashed. It was clear Karen had fought back with everything she had. On the bedroom wall, a phone had been ripped from its cradle. Detectives believe Karen may have raced upstairs ahead of her attacker in a desperate attempt to call for help. But in 1966, there was no universal emergency number like 911. Each town had its own local police number, and investigators speculated that in her panic, Karen might have dialed incorrectly, losing her only chance to reach someone in time. As investigators combed through the crime scene, they discovered another disturbing detail: a blood-covered light bulb lying on the floor. It had been unscrewed from the socket above the staircase. While the exact reason remained unclear, detectives believed the intruder may have unscrewed it while following Karen upstairs. Doing so might have briefly plunged the area into darkness, giving Karen a fleeting chance to try and call for help. Downstairs, in the bathroom, police found a pile of blood-stained items tossed in the bathtub. Among them were a pair of pants, a bedsheet, and a washcloth. Detectives believed the killer used these to wipe blood from his hands and clothing. He may have also tried to clean parts of the floor to obscure his tracks. But considering the sheer amount of blood spread throughout the house, any attempt to clean up was clearly unsuccessful. The presence of these items, and their placement in the bathtub, suggested something else as well. The killer had lingered in the home after the murder. For how long, detectives couldn't say, but it was clear he hadn't fled immediately. As the investigation progressed, police quickly ruled out robbery as the motive. Nothing of significant value was taken. The only missing items were Karen's blue wallet, which contained around $50, and one of the bedside lamps, an item of little worth. There was no sign of ransacking, no forced effort to find valuables. But the autopsy told a different, more terrifying story. Karen had been stabbed 124 times, with the majority of wounds centered on her chest. The excessive violence pointed to something far more personal than a break-in gone wrong. This was not a random act. The brutality suggested deep rage, and possibly a connection between the killer and his victim. Forensic experts believed the murder weapon was likely a knife with a narrow blade, possibly a stiletto. But despite a thorough search of the home and the surrounding area, the weapon was never found. Karen was fully clothed, and there were no signs of sexual assault. Still, investigators didn't rule out the possibility that the attacker may have had such an intent, but was interrupted or unable to carry it out for some reason. The medical examiner placed Karen's time of death between 4 and 6 p.m. Given that Paul discovered her body around 11 p.m., the killer had likely fled the scene several hours before her husband returned home. Detectives began their investigation by interviewing family members and friends. Paul's mother told police that Karen had recently expressed fear about living in the house. She had even talked about wanting to move back to Indiana, where her parents lived. But she never explained what exactly she was afraid of, and investigators couldn't uncover anything more specific. Karen's neighbors also offered an unusual detail. Their dog, known to bark at even the smallest sound, had remained silent that evening. To detectives, this suggested the intruder might not have been a stranger. With few solid leads, investigators turned their attention to the person statistically most likely to be involved: Karen's husband. In many violent crimes like this, the spouse is the first suspect. Detectives began taking a closer look at Paul and the crime scene. The attempted break-in at the back door and the shattered basement window, once seen as clear signs of forced entry, began to raise red flags. Investigators considered the possibility that these elements had been staged to make the murder look like a random burglary. The growing theory was that the killer knew Karen personally and had tried to cover their tracks by faking a break-in. If so, that meant the killer either had a key or Karen had willingly let them inside. As the investigation progressed, detectives focused closely on Paul Snyder, trying to determine whether he had the opportunity to kill his wife. One theory was that he may have committed the murder before heading to his evening shift. Since Paul had left home after lunch that day, investigators worked to establish a precise timeline and confirm whether he remained at work the entire time or left at any point. Paul firmly denied any involvement in Karen's death. Still, police continued to treat him as the prime suspect. With little physical evidence tying anyone to the crime, detectives repeatedly called Paul in for questioning, hoping to pressure a confession. But Paul never wavered. He maintained his innocence each time. Karen's funeral was held 6 days after her murder. Family, friends, and neighbors gathered to say goodbye, and among them were several detectives keeping a watchful eye. During the service, one man caught their attention. One of the pallbearers had a noticeable gash on his forehead and a bandaged hand. That man was James Barbier, a friend of both Paul and Karen. He worked with Paul at the railroad and had done some repair work at the couple's home shortly before the murder. Karen was familiar with him and likely would have felt safe opening the door for him. Intrigued, investigators started digging into James's whereabouts on the night of the murder. What they found raised serious concerns. On that same evening, James had checked into a local hospital with significant injuries to his face and hand, requiring stitches. The timing of those wounds matched the theory that the killer had cut himself while trying to enter the house through the broken basement window, where blood had been found on the shattered glass. With this new information, detectives shifted their focus. For the first time since the murder, they had a potential suspect other than Paul. With new questions surrounding James Barbier, detectives brought him in for questioning. Now considered the second suspect in Karen Snyder's murder, James denied any involvement. He explained his injuries by claiming he had been walking home drunk from a bar that night, tripped over a stump in the dark, and hurt himself on some splinters. His wife supported at least part of his story. She told police that James had come home that evening visibly shaken, with a bandaged hand and a cut on his forehead. But she also noted that he was a heavy drinker, known for getting severely intoxicated, so his erratic behavior that night wasn't out of the ordinary. Police canvassed the area and spoke with patrons and bartenders at local establishments near Karen's neighborhood. Several witnesses confirmed they had seen James at a bar that day, but none could give an exact time, making it difficult to confirm or rule out an alibi. Meanwhile, forensic experts had finished analyzing the blood evidence from the crime scene. As investigators suspected, there were two distinct blood types. One matched Karen's. The other, crucially, matched James Barbier's. While this wasn't definitive proof of guilt, it was enough for detectives to act. They arrested James, hoping the pressure might lead to a confession. At the same time, police officially cleared Karen's husband, Paul, from suspicion. None of the blood found at the scene matched his blood type. Despite the mounting evidence, James continued to deny any role in the murder. He insisted that his wounds were the result of a drunken fall, not a violent crime. Detectives held out hope that forensic experts might uncover more evidence to move the case forward. But that hope soon faded. The fingerprints collected at the scene were too smudged to be useful, and with DNA analysis still decades away, the blood evidence led nowhere. With no solid proof to hold him, police were forced to release James Barbier. The investigation continued, but the trail quickly began to grow cold. Over the years, police interviewed dozens of people and investigated several other potential suspects. Still, Karen Snyder's murder remained unsolved. The brutal killing left a lasting scar on the quiet town of Calumet, once considered a safe place to live. For many residents, the case became a grim reminder that such violence could happen anywhere. The question of who killed Karen lingered for decades. At the time of the investigation, police kept the identities of their suspects confidential, including James's. Only Karen's closest friends and family knew he had been considered a possible suspect. Years later, in interviews with journalists, several of them said they believed James was guilty, but without concrete evidence, there was no way to prove it. Karen's father died in 1973, just 7 years after her murder. Her mother passed away in 1977. Neither lived to see justice for their daughter. Paul eventually moved on and remarried. His second wife stepped into a difficult role, raising young Paula and becoming the mother the little girl never truly got to know. Wanting to protect her from the pain of the past, the family chose not to tell Paula the details of her biological mother's death. As a child, Paula Snyder didn't understand the full weight of her loss, but others didn't let her forget it. She later recalled how, once she started school, other children teased her simply because her mother had died. For years, her family shielded her from the horrific details. But as she got older, and the risk grew that she might hear the truth from classmates or stumble upon a newspaper article, her relatives decided to tell her what had really happened to Karen. Paula grew up carrying the unanswered questions. In 1989, her father, Paul, died at the age of 45 from health issues, never learning who had killed his first wife. For decades, the case sat cold. Paula, now an adult, occasionally gave interviews, publicly expressing hope that justice might one day be served. She said she regularly contacted the local police department for updates, but the answer never changed. There were no new leads. Then, in late 2022, something unexpected happened. The department handling Karen's case received a call from a 29-year-old man. He wasn't a direct witness, or even someone who lived in Calumet at the time of the crime. But he had grown up hearing about it. His grandmother, a distant relative of Karen's family, had often spoken about the murder when he was young. Curious and compelled, he had recently come across old newspaper clippings about the case while at work. That reading reignited his interest and led him to reach out to police. He asked whether any new developments had surfaced and wondered aloud if modern forensic tools might finally crack the decades-old mystery. It was the kind of call no one expected, but one that would soon spark a turning point in a case long thought forgotten. To the surprise of the young man who made the call, the police department chose to reopen the decades-old investigation into Karen Snyder's murder. None of the original detectives were still active, so a new team was assigned to the case. They began by reviewing every piece of evidence from scratch. What they found was promising. While many cold cases suffer from lost or damaged evidence, this one was different. Nearly all of the original materials, aside from the blood samples taken from the floor, had been preserved and remained in remarkably good condition. That included Karen's clothing and several items from her home, stored carefully over the past 56 years. Detectives sent all remaining evidence to the lab, where forensic experts began analyzing each item using modern technology. At the same time, investigators began re-interviewing anyone still alive who had been connected to the case all those years ago. After 16 months of renewed work, the breakthrough finally came. The lab contacted detectives with major news. They had discovered several small drops of blood on Karen's dress and successfully extracted a DNA profile belonging to an unknown male. With this profile in hand, police quickly obtained a warrant to collect a DNA sample from the original prime suspect, James Barbier, who was still alive. Once collected, his sample was rushed to the lab for comparison. The results were clear and decisive. James's DNA matched the blood found on Karen's dress. The evidence confirmed what investigators had long suspected. James Barbier, who was just 21 years old at the time of the murder, had been in Karen's home on the day she died. And the injuries he had once claimed were from a drunken fall were now undeniably tied to the crime. On April 29, 2024, police returned to the home of James Barbier. Now 79 years old, he was finally arrested for the 1966 murder of Karen Snyder. When confronted with the DNA evidence linking him to the crime, James did not protest. Instead, he confessed. Authorities have yet to release full details of his interrogation due to the ongoing legal process, but they confirmed that James admitted he had lived all his life knowing this day would eventually come. James was formally charged with first-degree murder. Because of his advanced age and severe health conditions, the court released him on bail. Officials determined that the risk of him fleeing was minimal. Still, the decision upset many of Karen's surviving relatives, who had already endured the pain of seeing her killer live freely for more than 5 decades. As for the motive, it remains unclear. The first court hearing took place at the end of May, and further details are expected to emerge only after the trial begins. Journalists covering the case have pointed to one prevailing theory, that James may have harbored feelings for Karen and resented her relationship with her husband, Paul. His reported level of intoxication on the night of the murder may have fueled a jealous rage that turned fatal. Despite the long wait for justice, Karen's family expressed deep gratitude to the detectives who reopened the case and finally secured an arrest. Still, with James's poor health, many acknowledged the likelihood that, even if he is sentenced, he may not spend much time behind bars. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means a lot to us and helps us grow. A huge thank you to everyone who's been watching. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means a lot to us and helps us grow. A huge thank you to everyone who's been watching. In 1988, 11-year-old Melissa Trimble disappeared from the streets of Lawrence, Massachusetts, while her mother was inside a nearby bar. The next day, her body was discovered near a rail yard, sparking outrage, grief, and a decades-long hunt for justice. Melissa Trimble was born on March 1, 1977, in Lawrence, Massachusetts. Just a month after her birth, her biological parents gave her up for adoption. She was adopted by Jeanette and Robert Trimble and raised in the nearby town of Salem, New Hampshire. Melissa was a lively, energetic child who had a love for fashion, singing, and reading from an early age. She had a wide circle of friends at school and spent much of her time at the Boys and Girls Club of America. When Melissa was 9 years old, her adoptive parents divorced. After that, her father no longer played a role in her life. Eventually, her mother began dating another man, also named Robert, though he didn't live with them. On September 11, 1988, when Melissa was 11, her mother took her to Lawrence to meet up with her boyfriend. They often spent time at a local bar, and because Jeanette didn't have anyone to watch Melissa, she frequently brought her along. To keep her occupied, Jeanette would usually let Melissa play outside while she stayed inside the bar. Melissa, used to the routine, spent time on the nearby sidewalks and streets. Her mother had always told her not to go too far, and Melissa followed that rule. Since her mom visited the same bar regularly, Melissa had become familiar with the area and had made friends with other neighborhood kids. On that particular day, she spent most of her time outside, occasionally checking in with her mother throughout the afternoon. At some point during one of her check-ins at the bartender made Melissa a bag of popcorn. She thanked him and said she'd be back soon, but she never returned. Around 4 p.m., Jeanette began to grow uneasy. Melissa had been gone longer than usual. She stepped outside and checked the car, hoping her daughter might be waiting there. But there was no sign of Melissa. Jeanette and her boyfriend Robert began searching nearby streets, walking through the neighborhood and asking around, but found nothing. As daylight faded, their panic deepened. After hours of searching on foot with no luck, Jeanette finally called the police around 9 p.m. Officers joined the search immediately, fanning out across the area. But by then, night had already fallen, making the search more challenging. Despite the darkness, police combed through the streets late into the night. One early theory was that Melissa might have run away, but her mother quickly dismissed the idea. She told officers that Melissa was afraid of the dark and hated being alone. She simply wouldn't have wandered off on her own. The next morning, Melissa was still missing. The search continued into the afternoon, until around 3 p.m., when police received a call from a railroad worker. He had been conducting a routine inspection at an old rail yard located just a few hundred yards from the bar. The yard was large, with up to 8 sets of tracks running through its widest point. Many of them hadn't been used in years, and rusted, empty boxcars sat scattered throughout. As the worker walked past 2 of the cars, something caught his attention, something that didn't belong. When he got closer, he saw what it was: a human body. He immediately contacted the police. When detectives arrived at the scene, they quickly confirmed what everyone had feared. The body was that of 11-year-old Melissa Trimble. Though she had been reported missing the day before, the confirmation came from a card with her name on it, issued by the Boys and Girls Club, found in a purse near the body. Melissa's body was lying on an active section of railroad tracks, and one of her legs had been severed. At first glance, it seemed possible that she had been struck by a train. But detectives were immediately skeptical that this was how she had died. The lead detective began piecing together the scene and found several troubling details. For one, Melissa's purse was discovered nearly 20 yards away from where her body lay. It didn't seem likely that a passing train could have thrown the purse that far. Even more concerning were the drops of blood and numerous footprints surrounding the spot where the purse was found. These signs pointed to the possibility that Melissa may have been attacked there, and that her body was later moved to the tracks in an attempt to stage an accident. Detectives also considered the setting. The old rail yard, filled with abandoned boxcars and overgrown paths, had long been known as a gathering place for homeless individuals and people involved in illegal drug use. Given the isolated nature of the area, investigators couldn't rule out the possibility that someone from this group had encountered Melissa and harmed her. From the beginning, the signs suggested something far more sinister than an accident, and now detectives had to find out who was responsible. Melissa Trimble's body was sent to the medical examiner's office for a full autopsy, while detectives continued combing through the case for any possible clues. With no physical evidence recovered at the scene, investigators shifted their focus to finding witnesses, hoping to reconstruct the final hours of Melissa's life. They first spoke with a railroad employee who had been working near the tracks the day before her body was discovered. He recalled seeing a young girl matching Melissa's description in the area. Concerned for her safety, he told her to leave immediately. According to him, she walked away without protest. Next, detectives found a woman who lived near the bar Melissa had visited with her mother. She told police she had known Melissa for several months. Their children had become friends, and Melissa often visited their home to play. On the day of her disappearance, Melissa had stopped by again to ask if the kids could come outside. But the woman said they were grounded and couldn't go out, so Melissa left on her own. Then came the first major lead. A local man reported seeing a girl resembling Melissa near an intersection close to the old rail yard. She was standing next to a van, speaking with the driver. The witness gave a detailed description of the man behind the wheel. He appeared to be in his 30s, overweight, disheveled, with dark hair and a thick beard. The van itself was described as old, rusty, and brown. This sighting stood out. Investigators believed the man might be connected to Melissa's death and began searching the area for vehicles matching that description. As detectives worked to track down leads, the medical examiner's office completed Melissa Trimble's autopsy, and the results confirmed their suspicions. The train had not caused her death. Melissa had suffered numerous bruises and 3 fatal stab wounds. There were no signs of sexual assault, and no foreign biological material was found on her body or clothing. Forensic experts also noted a telling detail. The stab wounds had likely been inflicted with the assailant's left hand, suggesting that the killer was left-handed. With that, the case was officially reclassified as a homicide. Detectives narrowed their focus to finding the person responsible. But with no physical evidence, no eyewitnesses to the crime itself, and no surveillance footage, they had just one lead: the description of the brown, rusty van seen near Melissa shortly before her disappearance. Police concentrated their efforts on identifying similar vehicles in the area. They stopped and inspected dozens of vans that matched the description, but each lead ended in disappointment. Even if they managed to locate the right van, detectives knew the odds were slim. Without DNA technology, which had not yet come into use, or solid physical evidence like fingerprints or Melissa's belongings inside the vehicle, linking the owner to the murder would be incredibly difficult without a confession. Still hoping to find new clues, officers went door to door and interviewed hundreds of local residents. Despite their exhaustive efforts, no new witnesses came forward, and no new evidence was found. For months, detectives pushed forward, but eventually, with no breakthroughs, the case went cold, leaving behind unanswered questions and a family still waiting for justice. Melissa Trimble's murder drew widespread media attention, and as coverage intensified, so did public outrage, much of it directed at her mother. Many criticized Jeanette for allowing her 11-year-old daughter to wander the streets alone, especially near a dangerous area like the rail yard. What angered people even more was the fact that while Melissa had been unsupervised for hours, Jeanette had been inside a bar drinking. Soon, rumors began to swirl in the press. Some outlets reported that Jeanette had developed a drinking problem following her divorce and was struggling to manage her responsibilities as a parent. Others pointed fingers at social services, accusing them of failing Melissa by not intervening in what some saw as a clearly unstable home environment. Amid the growing backlash, Jeanette refused to speak to reporters. She declined to answer questions and withdrew from the media spotlight entirely. When journalists reached out to Child Protective Services, officials acknowledged they were aware of the family's situation. They said they had taken some steps to monitor the home, but noted that removing Jeanette's parental rights had never been formally considered. As the years passed, the investigation remained stalled. Detectives revisited the case file multiple times and followed up on new tips, but none led to a breakthrough. Then, in 2000, 12 years after Melissa's death, investigators identified their first serious potential suspect, Tommy Lynn Sells. A known serial killer who had confessed to 22 murders, Sells fit a chilling profile. Many details of his known crimes closely resembled what had happened to Melissa. Even more alarming, he bore a strong resemblance to the man seen driving the van near the rail yard the day Melissa disappeared. Sells was also known to hop trains and often slept in abandoned boxcars while traveling across the country. For the first time in over a decade, there was a real possibility that the mystery of who killed Melissa Trimble might finally be solved. Detectives thoroughly investigated Tommy Lynn Sells' possible involvement in Melissa Trimble's murder. At first, his history and lifestyle seemed to align with the crime, but ultimately, investigators concluded he was unlikely to be the killer. They couldn't place him in Lawrence at the time of Melissa's disappearance. In fact, evidence suggested he was likely in another state altogether. Once again, the case went cold. Years passed with little progress until 2013, when a new lead surfaced unexpectedly. Detectives arrested a man from Lawrence in connection with an unrelated crime. During questioning, the man suddenly offered information about a case that had haunted the city for decades: the murder of Melissa Trimble. He explained that back in 1988, he was just 13 years old and frequently stole cars. He spent most of his time on the streets, and on the day Melissa disappeared, he recalled seeing a girl who looked like her sitting on the steps of the same bar where Melissa had last been seen. Sitting next to her, he said, was a man named Mike. The boy recognized Mike. His family had warned him to stay away from him because of his bad reputation. As the teenager walked past them, he didn't think much of it. But on his way back about 10 minutes later, he saw something that stuck with him. The girl was now walking away from the bar with Mike. At some point, another man joined them, someone the witness didn't recognize, and the three continued down the street together. Detectives asked why he had waited 25 years to come forward. The man admitted he had avoided police at the time, fearing any interaction due to the lifestyle he was living. He simply hadn't wanted to get involved. Now, for the first time in decades, investigators had a new direction and a name. After the man recalled seeing a girl who looked like Melissa Trimble the night she disappeared, he said he had considered telling someone at the time. He even asked his brother whether he should speak up, but his brother advised him to stay quiet. So he kept what he saw to himself. When detectives reviewed his account decades later, they immediately noticed a serious inconsistency. The witness claimed he saw the girl sitting on the bar steps after dark, but Melissa was reported missing around 4 p.m. when it was still light outside. By that time, bar patrons and staff were already aware of her disappearance, and her mother had been searching for her for hours. The idea that Melissa could have been sitting in plain sight on the bar steps without anyone noticing seemed highly unlikely. Police considered the possibility that the man had seen a different girl, or that his memory of the timeline was off. Still, they followed up on the one solid name he had provided. Detectives looked into Mike and investigated any possible connection he might have had to the case. But that too led nowhere. Even so, the man's story brought renewed attention to the long-dormant case. In 2014, authorities officially reopened the investigation. By then, DNA testing had become a standard part of modern forensic work, and detectives hoped that re-examining the old evidence might finally produce a breakthrough. Forensic experts reviewed all physical evidence tied to the case, including Melissa's clothing. Unfortunately, they found no foreign DNA. But there was something else. Fingernail scrapings collected during the original autopsy, saved in case Melissa had scratched her attacker while fighting back. When the samples were tested, analysts confirmed a promising discovery. Traces of foreign skin were present beneath Melissa's nails. The evidence was immediately sent to the lab for DNA profiling, and with it, a new sense of hope. While the discovery of foreign skin under Melissa Trimble's nails gave detectives a renewed sense of hope, it quickly came with a new obstacle. Forensic experts were able to extract a DNA profile from the sample, but it was only a partial one. It wasn't enough to generate a match in national databases, and without a full profile, investigators couldn't definitively identify the person behind it. Still, they refused to give up. Eventually, detectives reached out to a company that specialized in genetic genealogy. Despite the limited profile, the company agreed to take on the challenge. Their task wasn't easy. Working from a partial DNA sample made it impossible to identify a suspect with absolute certainty. But through painstaking research and analysis, the team managed to trace a potential distant relative of the unknown male in the available genetic databases. This discovery pointed investigators toward a family with the last name McClendon. From there, detectives began the long process of narrowing down possible suspects within that family. They carefully evaluated which members could have been in or near Lawrence in 1988, matching the timeline, geography, and other key details, such as age and background. Without a complete DNA profile, each step had to be built on careful deduction rather than direct evidence. Over the course of several years, their search zeroed in on two brothers, one of whom was Marvin McClendon. Marvin was living in Alabama at the time the case was reopened, but records showed that back in the late 1980s, he had lived just 20 minutes from Lawrence and had worked as a carpenter in the area. Now, after decades of dead ends, investigators had a name, a location, and a connection, and they were getting closer than ever to finally solving the case. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means a lot to us and helps us grow. A huge thank you to everyone who's been watching. In 1987, a young Canadian couple, Tanya Van Coilenborg and Jay Cook, vanished during a short trip to Seattle. Days later, their bodies were discovered miles apart, launching an intense cross-border investigation that would remain unsolved for over 3 decades. Tanya Van Kenborg was born on March 7, 1969, in Victoria, Canada. She grew up in a warm and supportive family, with parents who adored her and an older brother she was especially close to. From an early age, Tanya had a deep love for animals and often dreamed of one day becoming a veterinarian. She also had a strong desire to explore the world. A high school trip to Paris with her best friend only deepened that passion, planting in her a lifelong dream of travel and adventure. When Tanya was 18 and close to graduating from high school, she met Jay Cook. Jay had already finished school. He was 2 years older, but they connected through a mutual friend and quickly started dating. Their bond grew steadily over the following months. Although Tanya still aspired to study veterinary medicine, she decided to postpone college. Instead, she focused on working and saving up to travel. She took a job at a local cafe and also worked part-time as a dog walker. Jay had taken a similar path after graduation, choosing to help his father run the family's small heating installation business, rather than enroll in college. In November 1987, a routine business issue would set in motion a series of unexpected events. Jay's father received an order, but one of the necessary parts was out of stock locally. The closest place to find it was across the border in Seattle, Washington. Rather than wait for shipping, which would delay the job and cost more, he decided it would be faster and more efficient to pick up the part in person. But with his own schedule packed, he asked Jay if he'd be willing to make the trip for him. Jay Cook didn't hesitate to agree when his father asked him to make the trip to Seattle. He was happy to help with the family business, but he also had another reason to say yes. Jay saw it as an opportunity to spend time with Tanya Van Kenborg. They'd been dating for about 6 months, and while their relationship was still casual, Jay hoped the road trip might bring them closer. As he expected, Tanya was excited about the idea. She loved the chance to travel, even if it was just a quick overnight trip. The plan was simple. They would leave Victoria in the morning, drive to Seattle, spend the night there, and return home the next day. Jay's father handed over the family van, along with a $700 check to cover the cost of the part and some extra cash for travel expenses, including a hotel room. But Jay and Tanya decided to skip the hotel and save the money. They'd just sleep in the van. Though Seattle wasn't far from Victoria in terms of distance, the journey involved multiple steps. First, they had to take a ferry to Port Angeles, Washington, to cross into the U.S., and then another ferry near Seattle to complete the trip. On the morning of November 18, 1987, the couple packed up, got into the van, and boarded the first ferry. Their parents expected them home the following afternoon. But Jay and Tanya never came back. Almost as soon as Jay Cook and Tanya Van Kenborg missed their expected return, their families began to worry. They were familiar with the ferry schedules and knew that if the couple had boarded the ferry from Port Angeles as planned, they should have been home by now. Still, they tried to stay calm. Maybe, they thought, Jay and Tanya had decided to take a detour, enjoy the scenery, and extend their trip just a little longer. But as the hours passed with no word from either of them, concern quickly grew into alarm. Tanya's parents contacted Jay's family, and by that afternoon, both families were seriously concerned that something might have gone wrong. Despite their fears, they held on to the hope that the couple had simply chosen to be spontaneous. Maybe they'd missed a ferry, maybe they were just delayed. So they waited. But Jay and Tanya didn't return that night. The next morning, unable to wait any longer, both sets of parents went to the police to file a missing persons report. But the response they received was far from reassuring. Jay was 20, Tanya 18, legally adults, and there was no sign of foul play. Officers told the families there wasn't enough evidence to justify launching a search. It was possible, they said, that the couple had simply taken off on their own. The parents pushed back, explaining how out of character that would be. Still, the police insisted there was nothing they could do. Not yet. They recommended waiting a few more days. It was a response the families found deeply frustrating. But for the time being, their hands were tied. By this point, both families were convinced that something was seriously wrong. There was no way Jay and Tanya would have simply chosen to extend their trip without letting anyone know. Jay had been expected to complete an important task for his father's business, something he took seriously. And if they had made a spontaneous decision to stay longer, they would have called. Payphones were easy to find along their route. With growing frustration over the lack of action from authorities, Tanya's father decided to take matters into his own hands. He and Jay's parents began by calling the parts supplier in Seattle, the one Jay was supposed to visit. The man confirmed their fears. No one had come to pick up the order. He had waited for hours, but Jay and Tanya never arrived. Tanya's father then retraced the likely route from Victoria to Seattle, hoping to find any clue, a sign, a piece of evidence, even the van. But he found nothing. Still determined, he took the next step. He hired a private company and rented a helicopter to search the area from above. Together with a pilot, he flew over large stretches of land along the couple's route, hoping to spot the van from the air. But the effort came up empty. Much of the terrain was dense forest, difficult to navigate even from above. Refusing to give up, Tanya's father returned to Seattle, this time with flyers in hand. He posted them on street corners, telephone poles, and shop windows, doing everything he could to raise awareness and get the public's help. The families spent several days plastering the city with missing person notices. Finally, their persistence paid off. The local police department began to take the case seriously. What had started as a frustrating wait for answers was now officially a full investigation. Despite growing concern, authorities still clung to the belief that Tanya Van Kenborg and Jay Cook were simply off somewhere, spending time together, and would eventually return home. As a result, they limited their efforts to contacting colleagues in Seattle, sharing descriptions of the van and the couple, and asking to be notified if anyone reported seeing them. Then, on November 24th, 5 days after the couple disappeared, everything changed. A man was walking near a wooded area outside a small town roughly 90 miles north of Seattle. As he followed the road, he glanced down an embankment that led into a patch of thick forest. There, under a tree, something caught his eye. Curious, he got closer, and to his horror, realized it was a human body. He immediately called the police. Officers arrived quickly and discovered the body of a young woman. Her clothes were partially missing, her hands bound. She had suffered a gunshot wound to the head. The scene itself offered another clue. There was little to no blood around the body, indicating she had likely been killed somewhere else and left there. There was no identification on the victim, so investigators turned to the list of missing persons in the region. One entry stood out: Tanya Van Kenborg. They reached out to her father and asked him to come to the morgue. There, he confirmed what everyone feared. The body was his daughter. With the discovery of Tanya Van Kenborg's body, detectives launched a full-scale investigation to piece together what had happened. They quickly learned that Tanya had been traveling with her boyfriend, Jay Cook, who was now missing. So was the van they had taken on the trip. Given the circumstances, investigators had to consider every possibility, including Jay's potential involvement in Tanya's death. But Jay's family was adamant he couldn't have done something like this. They described him as kind, respectful, and deeply devoted to Tanya. He had never shown signs of aggression, and they pointed out that he didn't own a gun, nor would he have had easy access to one. As detectives searched for Jay and the missing van, they received another tip, this one from a nearby town called Bellingham, about 18 miles from where Tanya's body had been found. A bartender there had stepped outside and spotted a wallet and a set of keys lying on the ground. Curious, he picked them up and opened the wallet. Inside was an ID card with the name Tanya Van Kenborg. At first, he didn't think much of it. Assuming someone might return looking for the lost items, he brought them inside and set them aside. But later, when he saw a news report about Tanya's murder, he immediately realized the significance and called 911. Police arrived quickly and began searching the area around the bar. What they found deepened the mystery. Scattered nearby were several plastic zip ties, identical to the ones used to bind Tanya's hands. Underneath the back porch, detectives discovered rubber gloves and a half-empty box of ammunition. Whatever had happened to Tanya, it was now clear. Someone had prepared for it. But the most significant discovery was yet to come. While combing the area around the bar in Bellingham, one of the officers spotted a van parked nearby. A quick check confirmed what investigators feared. It was the same vehicle Tanya Van Kenborg and Jay Cook had taken on their trip. Inside, the van was a mess. Everything was scattered, broken, and thrown about, as if a struggle had taken place. Still, detectives managed to recover several important pieces of evidence. Among the debris were numerous receipts and a ferry ticket, which helped reconstruct the couple's route. These items confirmed that Tanya and Jay had made it to Seattle, and that whatever happened to them occurred shortly after. One thing stood out. Tanya's camera, which she had brought along to document the trip, was missing. It wasn't in the van, and it hadn't been found near her body either. Investigators began to suspect the killer might have taken it, possibly as a trophy, or to dispose of potential evidence. More concerning was the blood. The van's interior was stained with it. Forensic specialists collected multiple samples and sent them to a lab in Seattle. DNA technology was still in its early stages in 1987, but it had already proven useful in several investigations, and detectives hoped it would help here too. The results revealed 3 distinct DNA profiles, one belonging to Tanya, one to Jay, and a third, unidentified male. Without a national DNA database at the time, there was no way to match the unknown sample unless it could be directly compared to a suspect. For now, that third profile was a mystery, but it meant one thing clearly. Someone else had been in that van. Despite their early concerns, detectives gradually ruled out Jay Cook as a suspect in Tanya Van Kenborg's murder. The evidence, particularly the presence of a third, unidentified man's blood in the van, pointed to someone else. But that left investigators with 2 troubling questions. If Jay wasn't the killer, where was he? And was he still alive? Sadly, the answer came just 2 days later. On November 26th, a group of friends was out hunting a few dozen miles south of Seattle. While walking near a small bridge that crossed a narrow river, they spotted a body partially hidden in the bushes. They immediately contacted police. Detectives arrived on the scene and quickly identified the victim as Jay Cook. His body bore signs of a violent struggle, numerous bruises and abrasions. The cause of death appeared to be strangulation. Given the brutality, investigators briefly considered whether the killer might have known Jay personally and acted out of rage or revenge. They also developed a working theory about the sequence of events. Jay, they believed, was likely killed first. His body was found closer to Seattle, suggesting the perpetrator may have then driven north with Tanya still alive. Her body was discovered near the Canadian border, left in a remote wooded area. Further analysis from the medical examiner revealed that Tanya had been sexually assaulted before her death. DNA testing confirmed that the semen found on her body matched the same unknown man whose blood had been discovered in the van. But without a national DNA database in place, his identity remained a mystery, and the hunt for a killer continued. As the investigation into the murders of Tanya Van Kenborg and Jay Cook continued, detectives turned their focus to retracing the couple's steps. Using the receipts recovered from the van, they began to build a timeline of the trip, hoping it would shed light on where things went wrong. After taking the ferry from Victoria to Port Angeles, Tanya and Jay made their first stop at a local store to buy some food. From there, they set out toward Seattle. But at some point, Jay appeared to have taken a wrong turn, missing the most direct route to their destination. A receipt from a store in the small town of Hoodsport backed this up. A clerk at the store remembered seeing a young couple who matched their description. They had asked her for directions to the ferry crossing, and she clearly recalled their interaction. What stood out even more was what happened next. According to the clerk, a man in a brown raincoat entered the store just moments after the couple. She found it strange. The man didn't speak to them, but appeared to be watching. He left the store immediately after Tanya and Jay, though she didn't see where he went afterward. Another receipt placed the couple in the small town of Allen a short time later. From there, records showed they eventually made it to the ferry crossing near Seattle and purchased a ticket. Several witnesses confirmed seeing them in the area, but from that point on, their movements became a mystery. Detectives launched a broad search for potential suspects, focusing on individuals in the Seattle area with past convictions for violent crimes. They hoped to match one of them to the unidentified DNA profile found in the van and on Tanya's body, but the effort led nowhere. Each lead came up empty. For now, the killer remained unidentified, and the case stalled once again. Despite having the killer's DNA, investigators faced a frustrating reality. They had no idea who he was. The genetic evidence alone wasn't enough to identify him without a name to match it to. Detectives strongly believed this wasn't the work of a first-time offender. The crime had been too methodical, too calculated. It seemed likely the killer had followed Tanya and Jay for some time and seized the opportunity to abduct them once they reached Seattle. One theory suggested he may have approached them under the guise of needing help, perhaps asking for a ride, then later used a weapon to force them into compliance. Investigators also considered the possibility that the killer had intentionally left behind items like Tanya's belongings, the zip ties, and the rubber gloves. It felt like a message, a taunt to law enforcement, as if to say, "You won't find my fingerprints. I planned for this." Interestingly, forensic teams did lift several unidentified fingerprints from the van. But detectives were doubtful they belonged to the killer, who likely wore gloves throughout the crime. The fingerprints didn't match Tanya or Jay, and when they were run through available databases, they yielded no matches, another dead end. Over the next few weeks, police pushed forward, checking out new leads, re-interviewing potential witnesses, and following up on tips. They also investigated various individuals with criminal histories who could have fit the profile. But none of it brought them any closer to identifying the man who had taken Tanya and Jay's lives. Then, about a month after the murders, something unexpected happened. In December, the families of Tanya Van Kenborg and Jay Cook began receiving letters and postcards, all from someone claiming to be the killer. The messages were chilling. The sender described the crimes in disturbing detail, taunted the victims' families, and declared that the police would never catch him. Some letters arrived around holidays, which investigators believed was an intentional move to inflict even more pain during already emotional times. Detectives attempted to trace the origin of the letters, but in the late 1980s, this kind of investigation was extremely limited. They were able to determine the cities and states from which the letters had been mailed, but that information didn't lead them any closer to identifying the person behind them. What stood out was the pattern. The letters were postmarked from various locations across the United States, suggesting the sender was constantly on the move. This fueled speculation that the killer was a drifter, always one step ahead. But not everyone was convinced the letters were real. In high-profile murder cases, it's not uncommon for hoaxers to send false confessions or cruel messages, pretending to be the perpetrator. Investigators couldn't rule out that possibility here. The idea that someone unrelated to the crime might take advantage of a tragedy to torment grieving families was, unfortunately, all too plausible. Despite the emotional toll, police continued to investigate. But with each letter, the mystery deepened, and the trail grew colder. For years after the murders of Tanya Van Kenborg and Jay Cook, the case remained at a standstill. Detectives continued to investigate leads and examine possible suspects, but no major breakthroughs emerged. One theory they explored was the possibility that the killer was a serial offender. This idea was fueled by the fact that, in the years surrounding Tanya and Jay's deaths, 2 other young couples had also been abducted in the same region of Washington state. However, the connections between the cases were thin. Though the timing and locations were similar, police could not establish solid evidence linking the crimes. Over the years, several serial killers were apprehended in the Pacific Northwest, but none were ever tied to the murders of Tanya and Jay. In 2003, the investigation was officially reopened. Detectives submitted the unknown perpetrator's DNA profile to the FBI's national database, hoping that advancements in forensic technology might finally deliver a match. But once again, the results came back empty. Still, investigators believed the man responsible likely had a criminal past. Perhaps he had never been caught, or had been arrested before DNA collection became a standard procedure. Then, in 2010, the case resurfaced in the public eye when it was featured on a popular national television program. The renewed attention sparked a wave of fresh tips, including one that caught detectives' interest. A caller claimed he might know who had sent the disturbing letters to the victims' families all those years ago. The promising tip from the 2010 television broadcast led detectives to a 78-year-old man living in Seattle. As they dug into his background, investigators discovered that he had spent years traveling extensively across the United States, and his travel history closely aligned with the cities from which the taunting letters to Tanya and Jay's families had been mailed. It didn't take long for detectives to conclude that he was, in fact, the author of those letters. But he had no connection to the actual murders. The man was suffering from serious mental health issues, and when police tested his DNA, the results were clear. It did not match the blood or semen recovered from the crime scenes. The letters, it turned out, were cruel hoaxes written by someone entirely unrelated to the case, bringing years of false hope and torment to the families. The case fell quiet again. By 2018, with no new leads, detectives decided to try a different kind of tool. They reached out to Parabon Nanolabs, a company known for using DNA to generate composite sketches of unknown suspects. With nothing else to go on, investigators hoped this new technology might finally help crack the case. Parabon created several composite images of what the killer might look like at different ages based on his DNA traits. Police released the sketches to the media and urged the public to come forward if anyone recognized the man. But once again, the effort led nowhere. Still, detectives remained determined. If the sketch couldn't identify him, perhaps his genetics could. That's when they turned to a rapidly growing field with a proven track record: genetic genealogy. Parabon Nanolabs uploaded the unknown killer's DNA profile to public genealogy databases, hoping to identify even a distant relative. Before long, their work paid off. They found a possible second cousin of the suspect and began meticulously tracing her family tree, narrowing their focus to men who had lived in or near Seattle in 1987 and matched the likely age range of the killer. Working alongside the cousin, investigators finally landed on a name: William Talbot. Talbot, 55, was living in a Seattle suburb and working as a long-haul truck driver. He fit every criterion: location, age, and proximity to the crime scenes at the time of the murders. But before making an arrest, detectives needed something more: a direct DNA match. They placed Talbot under surveillance and, after a few days, collected a discarded coffee cup he had thrown away. The saliva on the rim provided the DNA sample they needed. The results left no doubt. It was a perfect match to the DNA found on Tanya Van Kenborg's body and in the van where the couple had last been seen. In mid-May 2018, 30 years after the brutal killings of Tanya and Jay, police arrested William Talbot. He denied any involvement, and the case moved to trial. The trial began in 2019, and Talbot's defense team focused their strategy on challenging the DNA evidence. They argued that the semen found on Tanya's body could have come from a consensual encounter. As for Jay's death, they noted that prosecutors had no physical evidence tying Talbot directly to the murder. No fingerprints, no witnesses, and no forensic trace linking him to the scene. Still, the prosecution remained firm. The DNA told a clear story, and the person responsible had finally been found. The prosecution came prepared with more than just DNA. They revisited a detail from the original investigation. In 1987, forensic experts had found unidentified fingerprints inside the van Jay and Tanya had driven. At the time, those prints matched neither victim nor anyone in the national database. Now, with William Talbot in custody, experts compared the prints again. And this time, they had a match. The fingerprints belonged to him. Another important piece of evidence came from one of Talbot's acquaintances. The man testified that in 1987, he saw a brown van parked outside William's home, a vehicle he said clearly did not belong to him. While it was unclear whether the van appeared before or after the murders, it suggested Talbot may have brought it home at some point during the crime timeline. Talbot also lived just a few miles from where Jay's body was discovered, strengthening the prosecution's argument that he was familiar with the area. None of William's family members attended the trial, but when interviewed by investigators, they painted a troubling picture. According to relatives, Talbot was known for his aggressive behavior, so much so that many had distanced themselves from him long ago. Some even admitted they weren't surprised when they heard he'd been charged with such a brutal crime. Prosecutors laid out a theory. Talbot had approached Tanya and Jay under the pretense of needing a ride to Seattle. Once inside the van, he waited until nightfall, then used a gun to force them off their route and into a remote area. At some point, he killed them in separate locations, and later ditched the van and Tanya's belongings in another town. For the next 30 years, he remained undetected. With no confession, many of the details will likely never be fully known. But the physical evidence was overwhelming, and few doubted the jury's conclusion. In June 2019, William Talbot was found guilty of the double murder of Tanya Van Kenborg and Jay Cook. He was sentenced to 2 life terms, without the possibility of parole. The case made headlines nationwide as the first in U.S. history to secure a conviction using genetic genealogy. However, the case didn't end there. Talbot's attorneys filed an appeal, arguing that the jury had been biased, a claim they said undermined their client's right to a fair trial. In 2021, a judge agreed and overturned the conviction, granting Talbot a new trial. But in 2022, a higher court reversed that decision, reinstating the original conviction and upholding the sentence. As for whether Talbot is connected to other unsolved crimes, investigators remain unsure. While he had prior convictions for lesser offenses, He had never before been charged with a violent crime. Still, the calculated nature of Tanya and Jay's murders, and his ability to evade justice for decades, suggested to many that this may not have been his first time. Whether other victims are out there may never be known.